There is a fact that slips past most people's awareness. Stalkers often begin long before the victim realizes. The watching starts quietly, with footsteps that blend into the crowd, a glance too long at the edge of vision, a figure standing across the street that seems to always be there. By the time a victim notices, by the time the unease blooms into fear, the obsession is already deep, already fed, already waiting. That is the terror most people do not think about. That someone could be watching right now, and you would not know. Imagine this scene, the yellow glow of a porch light at night. The kind of light meant to make a home feel safe. The door is locked, the curtains are drawn, the house is silent. Inside, someone believes they are alone. But just beyond the edge of light, a figure stands, hood pulled low, motionless. The face is hidden, but the posture speaks. Waiting, watching, measuring. A voice, steady and quiet, lingers in the mind. You do not notice them until it is too late. Stalking is not loud. It is not dramatic at the beginning. It is patient. It lives in repetition. A car parked on the same corner every evening. A phone call that ends the moment it is answered. The sound of footsteps on a street where no one else is walking. Each act, small enough to doubt, small enough to dismiss, builds into a pattern that traps the victim in uncertainty. And uncertainty is the cruelest weapon. For those who have lived through it, the fear is not in being attacked outright. The fear is in never knowing when the waiting will end. It is in lying awake at night, staring at the door, knowing that just beyond it someone might be standing still, breathing slowly, refusing to leave. The silence outside becomes heavier than any noise. Stalker stories are not born in shadows of imagination. They are real, drawn from lives twisted into constant vigilance. They are scars carried by those who discovered too late that the stranger who followed them home was not passing through, that the figure outside their window was not coincidence, that the sound at the edge of hearing was not just the wind. And so the story begins not with violence, but with stillness. A figure at the door, a stranger who is not truly a stranger, a night where safety was an illusion. What does it mean when someone knows where you live, what time you return, what light you leave on when you are afraid? What does it mean when you realize your movements are no longer yours? That each step is being recorded by someone who has decided to erase the distance between themselves and you. The question echoes. When the figure outside does not leave, when the watching stretches into days, into weeks, into months, what happens then? Some victims speak of the moment they first felt the shift, the way the air seemed to change, the way routine cracked. They describe the heaviness of being watched, not in a crowded place, but in the quiet moments meant for rest. They describe locking doors twice, checking windows 3 times, unplugging phones at night. They describe the sound of their own heartbeat in the silence, wondering if it is loud enough for the stranger outside to hear. The most disturbing truth is that many of these stories do not end with an arrest, or an escape, or even recognition of who stood in the dark. They end with the victim moving away, carrying the paranoia with them, or worse, with the victim disappearing into silence, their final hours unknown. The figure never unmasked. This story does not offer comfort. It does not offer justice. It offers the reality of what it means to live with a shadow stitched into your life, a shadow that knows your schedule better than you do, that memorizes your habits, that grows stronger each time you hesitate. The porch light glows. The door stays shut. The house seems calm, but the figure outside does not move. They do not knock. They do not speak. They only wait. And the question, the one that lingers at the edge of every thought, remains. When someone chooses to watch you, when they decide you are the center of their obsession, how do you ever know when they will stop watching? This is where the story begins. On the night when safety collapsed into silence, and the door was no longer just wood and metal, but the only thing between life and whatever stood waiting outside. Stalker stories never begin with violence. They begin with the illusion of safety, with routine so ordinary that nothing feels out of place until the pattern cracks. The setting was familiar, comfortable. A quiet neighborhood lined with houses that looked almost identical, doors painted in muted colors, mailboxes waiting for their daily weight of envelopes and bills. Street lamps hummed softly, casting pools of yellow light across cracked sidewalks. Curtains were drawn, televisions glowed inside, and dogs barked lazily at the sound of passing cars. To an outsider, it seemed safe. Nothing unusual, nothing to fear. But safety is not always what it seems. Safety is often the mask worn by silence before it shifts into something else. For the one who lived in the small brick house at the end of the street, life had followed a steady rhythm. Work in the morning, errands in the afternoon, evenings spent reading or watching television with the faint hum of the porch light filtering through the curtains. They valued routine. They trusted the lock on the door. They trusted the familiarity of neighbors who waved politely, even if conversations rarely went beyond pleasantries. The neighborhood was not close-knit, but it carried the illusion of community, the kind of place where danger was assumed to belong somewhere else. The first signs of intrusion were so subtle that they did not seem worth remembering at the time. A feeling of being watched while walking home from the corner store, the sound of footsteps that matched too closely with their own rhythm, only to vanish when they turned around. The sight of a car idling at the curb, headlights off, its engine whispering faintly into the night. These were details that could be explained away. Paranoia, coincidence, imagination. People often dismiss the first warning signs because acknowledging them too early feels unreasonable. And stalkers rely on that hesitation. Neighbors noticed little. They rarely looked outside at night, and when they did, the glow of the porch light at the brick house seemed ordinary. They did not notice the shadow at the edge of the yard, standing still for minutes at a time. They did not notice the same hooded figure leaning against the fence, silent and patient. Even when they thought they noticed something, they convinced themselves it was harmless. After all, no one wanted to admit that danger had arrived so close to home. The town itself had seen stories like this before, though no one spoke about them openly. There were whispered accounts of people who moved away suddenly, leaving homes empty with no explanation. A woman who had once lived across the street packed her things in a single night, driving away without saying goodbye. Another resident stopped going outside after dark, their windows boarded up despite the safety of the neighborhood. But these details faded quickly, buried under new routines, ignored because they did not fit the image of safety people wanted to believe in. The person in the brick house noticed small changes within their own home. Items out of place, doors left ajar when they were sure they had been shut. At first they blamed themselves, forgetfulness, distraction, fatigue. But deep down, unease lingered. The house no longer felt like their own. It felt shared, as though invisible eyes moved across the walls, as though someone else knew the space better than they did. Phone calls came next. At first they rang only once or twice late at night. The line would be silent when answered, heavy with the sound of breathing just beyond the edge of hearing. The silence stretched too long, deliberate, until the receiver was slammed down in panic. When they reported it, friends shrugged it off. Wrong number. Prank call. It happens. But the calls continued, always at the same time, always ending the same way. Silence. Then the faintest click. The psychological weight grew heavier. Walking home in the evening became a test of endurance. Every step felt measured, every sound amplified. The sensation of being followed no longer faded with a glance behind. It lingered. It grew stronger with each passing day. They began to notice details they could no longer ignore. The same car parked near the corner. The same footsteps behind them even when the street was empty. The same shadow cast just beyond the edge of the porch light. By now, safety had collapsed into performance. Locks were checked twice, then 3 times. Curtains were closed early. And yet the faintest outline of a figure still appeared beyond the fabric, unmoving. Sleep came in fragments broken by jolts of fear at imagined noises. But not all of the noises were imagined. The front gate clicked softly at night, though no one entered. The sound of footsteps pressed against the gravel driveway, stopping just short of the door. The figure outside never knocked. They never spoke. They never left notes or demands. They only stood waiting, their presence heavier than any action. And in many ways, that was worse. Violence announces itself. It leaves no room for doubt. But silence, patience, stillness, these leave the mind to do the work, to fill the gaps with fear that grows sharper each day. The house at the end of the street was no longer part of the neighborhood. It was marked, separated, set apart by the presence that refused to leave. And inside, the occupant began to realize a truth that would change everything. Being alone does not mean unseen. The pattern of fear did not erupt all at once. It bled slowly into the days, into the nights, until every detail seemed touched by something unnatural. What began as faint unease grew into an undeniable sequence, a timeline carved into memory. The first shift came in the evenings. Walking home no longer felt like walking alone. The air seemed different behind them, footsteps matching, never overtaking, never falling away, always present. When they turned their head, the street remained empty, but the rhythm of those steps echoed in their mind long after silence returned. It was not a single night. It happened again and again, until every return home was a ritual of dread. The phone calls worsened. Not just once or twice a week, but nearly every night. The same silence on the line, the same low breath lingering just long enough to confirm it was no accident. They began unplugging the phone, but then the ringing came from the cell instead. Calls logged from unknown number, sometimes multiple times in a single hour. Answering brought the same result, silence. Yet the silence was not empty. It carried the weight of someone listening, waiting for the sound of fear in the victim's voice. Strange details began to appear around the house. Mailboxes left open when they were closed the night before. Footprints pressed into the soil under the window, larger than their own. The gate latch unhooked, though it had been secured. At first they tried to explain it away. Delivery workers, neighborhood kids, coincidence. But the details piled too neatly, too deliberate. The stalker was not careless. They wanted to be noticed, but only in fragments. Enough to unsettle, enough to erode the boundary between safety and intrusion. Sleep became impossible. They would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear beyond the walls. The sounds came without warning. Soft gravel crunching outside, the faint squeal of the back gate, the creak of weight on the porch boards. Sometimes they thought they heard whispering near the window, low enough to make out no words but clear enough to know it was human. They froze in bed, the blanket clutched tightly, knowing someone was just on the other side of the glass, and then silence again. Neighbors began to notice only fragments, a figure standing at the end of the street, unmoving for long stretches of time, a car idling at odd hours. They dismissed it as coincidence, the kind of strangeness every neighborhood collects. When asked, some admitted seeing a man in a hood leaning near the fence, but they convinced themselves it was harmless. Someone waiting for a ride, someone passing through. But the victim knew better. The figure was not passing through. The figure belonged to them now. The stalker never broke the door, never forced entry. They did not need to. The true terror lay in how they unstitched the idea of safety without stepping inside. They rattled the doorknob softly at night, not to enter but to remind the occupant that they could. They tapped on the glass once and then vanished, leaving no trace but the memory of the sound. The intention was not violence. The intention was control. The escalation became undeniable when objects inside the house shifted. A framed photo on the mantel tilted slightly to the left. A mug once left in the kitchen sink reappeared on the counter. The victim swore they had not moved them. Panic set in. Had the stalker been inside? Were they standing in the room, silent, unseen, while the victim moved through the house unaware? Every creak of the floorboards became suspect. Every shadow carried suggestion. Attempts to report it brought little relief. Police arrived, took notes, walked the property, but no figure was found. They offered words like, probably nothing, and keep the doors locked. Their visit left no sense of protection, only the bitter realization that help could not stop something that thrived in silence. The victim's world shrank further, every night closing in tighter than the one before. By now, the paranoia had settled into the bones. Walking to the corner store felt like stepping into a trap. Every reflection in a storefront window was studied. Every stranger on the street measured for intent. The victim no longer trusted daylight. Shadows lingered even in the sun. They began changing routes home, leaving work at different times, varying routines in desperate attempts to shake the figure that always found them anyway. One night, the presence escalated further. A note appeared on the porch, slipped under the doorframe. No words, only a crude drawing of an eye staring straight ahead. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, as though it had been burned and then spared. The handwriting was meaningless, jagged and uneven, but the message was clear. The stalker wanted them to know they were being studied, that every moment was being consumed. That resistance was useless. From that night forward, the fear was no longer occasional. It was constant. Breathing felt heavier. Eating carried no taste. Sleep collapsed into fragments of nightmare and half-conscious listening. The figure had not broken the body, but they had broken the mind. And that was the deeper violence, the kind no one else could see, the kind that hollowed out the soul while leaving the body intact. The buildup of the mystery lay not in what the stalker did, but in what they refused to do. They never revealed themselves fully. They never demanded. They never struck. They only stayed, always watching, always waiting. And that patience was more terrifying than any sudden act of violence. It meant the victim was no longer living for themselves, but living in the shadow of someone else's obsession, and the most haunting question remained unanswered. How long had it been happening before they even noticed? How many nights had the figure stood in the yard, breathing quietly under the porch light, while the victim slept soundly inside, unaware that they were no longer alone? The evidence left behind was thin, fragile, and always just enough to raise questions, but never enough to give answers. Stalkers thrive in that space, where proof is elusive, where victims sound uncertain, where silence eats credibility. For investigators, it was a trail of fragments. For the victim, it was a web of certainty no one else could see. The first piece was the note, a sheet of paper left under the door, marked with a crude drawing of an eye. It was not art. It was not even legible as handwriting. It was raw, jagged, uneven, pressed so hard into the page that the pen nearly tore through. It carried no words, only intent. When shown to authorities, it was labeled as strange but inconclusive. To the victim, it was not inconclusive. It was confirmation. Someone had crossed the boundary, had touched their door, had claimed access to their silence. Then there were the footprints, shallow impressions in the soil beneath the bedroom window, appearing after nights when whispers had been heard outside the glass. The prints were larger than the victim's own shoes, spaced evenly, as though someone had stood there for long stretches without moving. Rain softened them, blurred them, erased them before they could be cast or measured. But the memory of seeing them, the sick recognition that someone had stood inches from where they slept, did not wash away. The phone records offered more questions. Multiple calls logged from unknown number, always at the same time of night, always ending in silence. Investigators explained that caller ID can be masked, that numbers can be rerouted, that technology makes anonymity simple. But the timing betrayed intent. It was not randomness. It was ritual. Whoever dialed those numbers did so with precision, feeding on the dread of waiting for the phone to ring. Inside the house, subtle changes testified to intrusion. A photo frame tilted on the mantel, a coffee mug placed where it had not been left, a bedroom door ajar though it had been shut tight. These were dismissed by outsiders as forgetfulness, the tricks of a stressed mind. But the victim knew the difference between what they had touched and what they had not. The small disturbances were not accidents. They were signals. Someone had been there, breathing the same air, moving through the same space, invisible until the aftermath revealed them. Neighbors offered conflicting testimonies. One said they saw a figure standing near the fence late at night but could not describe details, only the impression of a hood, a posture too still. Another swore they saw a car idling near the corner for hours, but could not recall the license plate, could not remember if it was the same car each time. Some claimed they saw nothing at all. Their silence was not disbelief, but fear of involvement. To speak aloud was to risk drawing attention, to risk becoming the next object of observation. Even experts disagreed. A psychologist argued that the mind under stress invents patterns, that paranoia creates its own evidence. He called the silence on the phone suggestion, the shifting object's memory distortion. But when pressed about the footprints, about the note, about the neighbor's sightings, his answers thinned. He repeated the word coincidence too many times, as if trying to convince himself. A criminologist, however, pointed to the clear signs of escalation. Stalkers, he explained, begin with observation. They linger in spaces just outside awareness, building courage, savoring control. They test boundaries, rattling doors, tapping windows, leaving silent calls. Each act is a rehearsal, a step toward something deeper. He warned that the note was not harmless. It was the first sign of intrusion shifting into communication. It meant the stalker wanted recognition. It meant they had grown bolder. Yet even this analysis fractured under the weight of contradictions. No single suspect emerged. Some believed it was a stranger passing through, an unknown figure with no connection to the victim. Others whispered that it might be someone closer, someone from work, someone from the neighborhood, someone whose face was familiar by day but hidden by night. Both theories carried weight. Both carried terror. One meant danger could be anywhere. The other meant danger was already inside their circle of trust. The police reports collected the fragments, note, prints, calls, testimonies, but closed each file with the same phrase: insufficient evidence. The case never moved forward, and that absence of resolution was its own kind of violence. The victim lived in a reality where proof existed only in half-formed pieces, never enough to protect them, never enough to stop what was happening. And then came the contradictions that deepened the dread. Some nights the phone rang while the figure was seen outside. Who was holding the phone if the stalker was standing in the yard? Some mornings the footprints appeared though the soil was undisturbed the night before, as if they had been pressed into place without movement. And most chilling of all, the victims swore they once heard the whisper of their own name outside the window, spoken in a voice they recognized, but no one could confirm it. The evidence did not align. Theories split apart. Each detail was sharp enough to wound, but too fragmented to form a whole picture. And perhaps that was the design. Perhaps the stalker never intended to leave proof. Proof is closure. Proof is resolution. Without it, the silence thrives. The victim's notes grew frantic. Pages filled with times, dates, sketches of footprints, transcriptions of calls that contained no words. Each entry ended the same way: still outside, still waiting. The analysis gave no answers. The fragments refused to form a whole. The truth dissolved in contradictions. And in that gap, fear grew larger, because if evidence could not explain what was happening, then what remained? Only the certainty of being watched, of being followed, of being measured by someone who refused to reveal themselves. And the most haunting question lingered, heavier than any clue. If every piece of evidence contradicts itself, does that mean the stalker was closer than anyone imagined, or that there was more than one? Fear is not always an explosion. More often, it is erosion. It begins as a crack in the surface and spreads slowly, silently, until the foundation beneath collapses. That is what the stalker created. A life hollowed out by presence, by silence, by the certainty of being observed when no one else believed it. At first, the victim still tried to cling to normality. They woke each morning, went through routines, carried groceries, and greeted neighbors with the same cautious smile. But beneath the surface, nothing felt the same. Each step down the street carried weight. Each glance over the shoulder revealed nothing, yet confirmed everything. The unease became constant, a pressure on the chest that never lifted. The smallest noises in the house became unbearable. A pipe groaning, the fridge humming, the soft crack of wood settling, all were filtered through the mind's growing panic. Each sound could be him. Each sound could be proof that the walls were no longer boundaries. At night, the silence pressed harder, so heavy it seemed alive. Breathing slowed, ears strained for the faintest movement outside. Sleep arrived in fragments, shattered by jolts of terror at shadows that seemed to move or whispers that faded before they could be understood. The toll on the body was visible. Skin lost its color, dark circles carved deep beneath the eyes. Food lost its taste, meals left half-finished on the counter. Hands trembled, not just at night but during the day, even in moments of quiet. Their posture changed, shoulders hunched inward, head lowered as if bracing for something unseen to strike. The physical form was still intact, but the spirit inside had begun to collapse. The phone calls became unbearable. Every ring was a dagger. Even in moments when the phone remained silent, the expectation of its sound lingered like static in the air. They began to jump at the smallest vibration, unable to separate real from imagined. Friends grew tired of hearing the complaints, of answering late-night calls filled with whispers of, "Someone is out there." Some tried to reassure, others dismissed the fear as paranoia. Slowly, the victim stopped reaching out at all, retreating into isolation. The stalker had not only invaded the home but also severed connections with the outside world. The community, too, withdrew. Neighbors who once waved from porches now avoided eye contact. Their silence carried its own message. Involvement meant risk. It was easier to pretend nothing unusual was happening, safer to believe the victim's fear was exaggeration, safer to say nothing at all. And so the isolation grew heavier, pressing in on all sides. The psychological damage deepened. The victim began to doubt themselves, replaying memories over and over in search of clarity. Did the photo frame truly shift? Did the footprints truly appear? Were the whispers real? Or was the mind turning against itself? That uncertainty was the stalker's true weapon. It did not matter if every detail was real. What mattered was that fear had taken root so deeply that the victim could no longer trust their own perception. The house itself transformed into a prison. Rooms no longer offered comfort. The windows, once a source of light, now felt like weaknesses, thin barriers easily crossed. Doors locked at night were checked again and again but never felt secure. Even the air felt tainted, carrying a sense of being shared with someone unseen. The victim no longer felt alone even in solitude. And that was the cruelest realization. Loneliness is not the same as being alone. Being alone means safety. Loneliness in the presence of a stalker means exposure. Paranoia turned inward. Each shadow of thought grew suspicious. They began to wonder if the stalker was someone close, someone from work, a neighbor, a face glimpsed in passing. Every interaction with another person became contaminated with dread. A simple smile felt like a mask-hiding obsession. A casual question felt like surveillance. Trust collapsed. The stalker did not need to enter the house to destroy it. They only needed to live inside the victim's mind, to poison every thought until nothing safe remained. The emotional toll deepened further when nights stretched into weeks. Hope that it would stop dissolved. Hope that someone would intervene collapsed. Life narrowed to survival, checking locks, pulling curtains, listening to the silence, waiting for the next sign. There was no room left for joy, for laughter, for peace. Each day became preparation for the night. Each night became preparation for survival. And through it all, the stalker remained silent. No demands, no words, no identity. That silence was worse than any threat. A threat declares intent. Silence means endless possibilities. Silence means the danger could arrive at any moment or never, and the waiting is the violence itself. The victim's notes became fragmented. Words broke off mid-sentence. Pages carried frantic sketches of eyes, of doors, of faceless figures standing in the yard. The writing no longer sought answers. It sought release. A way to pour the fear onto the page, to anchor it somewhere outside the mind. But even the act of writing felt dangerous, as though the stalker could see the words forming, as though the page itself was being read by unseen eyes. Fear did not only consume the victim, it spread. Family members who visited began to feel it too. They spoke of the air being heavy, of sensing something at the window, of the silence feeling wrong. Some refused to stay overnight, leaving before dusk. Others avoided the house altogether, unable to endure the suffocating presence that lingered in every corner. By then, it no longer mattered whether the stalker was outside the door or inside the mind. The damage had been done. The life that once carried routine had been hollowed into paranoia. The home that once offered comfort had been reshaped into a cage, and the person who once lived freely now existed only as a shadow of fear, their every breath measured by the thought of someone standing just beyond the light, waiting, watching, never leaving. When the fear could no longer be contained inside the house, it spilled into official reports, police notes, neighborhood whispers, and speculation from those who claimed to know how stalkers think. Each attempt at explanation revealed more contradictions than answers. Every theory tried to put a shape to the shadow. None succeeded. Authorities followed procedure. Officers walked the property, looked for signs of forced entry, checked the gate and the windows. They found the footprints in the soil beneath the window but called them inconclusive. They noted the phone calls but explained that numbers could be masked or rerouted, that prank calls were common. They acknowledged the note, but without handwriting, samples, or fingerprints, it was considered meaningless. Their words were calm, methodical, and clinical. Insufficient evidence. The file was opened, logged, and quietly shelved. To the victim, it was not insufficient. It was overwhelming. To the authorities, it was nothing they could act upon. This gap left room for theories. Some argued that the stalker was not a stranger at all. They believed it was someone known to the victim, someone close enough to memorize routines and gather details unnoticed. A coworker who walked past the desk too often, a neighbor who lingered too long outside, an acquaintance who smiled politely in daylight but stood in silence at night. This theory carried its own kind of horror, that trust had already been broken, that the stalker's eyes were familiar. If true, it meant safety could never return because safety had already been betrayed. Others argued the opposite. They claimed it was a transient figure, someone who drifted from place to place, feeding on the vulnerability of isolation. To them, the stalker was faceless, nameless, with no connection beyond obsession, a shadow that could vanish at any moment, only to appear in another town outside another door. That explanation gave no comfort. A stranger with no ties had no reason to stop, no reason to fear consequences, no reason to see the victim as anything other than prey. Psychologists weighed in with clinical distance. They described the behavior as obsessive surveillance, an addiction to control rather than violence. Some stalkers, they explained, thrive not on contact but on the power of being unseen, of shaping their victim's life without ever stepping fully into it. They said silence is not absence but dominance, the proof that the stalker decides when fear begins and when it ends. Yet others in the same field contradicted this view. They warned that escalation was inevitable, that stalkers who tested boundaries would eventually break them. To them, silence was rehearsal, waiting for the moment to act. Both theories were convincing. Both were terrifying. Neither resolved the truth. Rumors spread in the community, whispered in the safety of daylight. Some claimed there were multiple stalkers, that no single person could be in so many places at once. They said one left the notes, another made the calls, another stood in the yard. Others dismissed this, arguing that the human mind under stress exaggerates, that paranoia can turn one shadow into many. But the contradiction only deepened the unease. Was it one person with endless patience, or was it more than one? Which possibility was worse? Conspiracy theories emerged too. Some whispered about organized surveillance, about hidden networks that monitored without revealing their presence. They spoke of experiments in fear, of groups that chose targets at random to observe how lives unraveled. There was no evidence, only speculation, but the idea lingered. If true, then the stalker was not an individual at all, but part of something larger, something without face or name, something that could never be stopped because it was never just one person. A few went further still, suggesting the possibility that the stalker was not entirely human. They pointed to contradictions, the simultaneous phone calls and sightings, the footprints that appeared without tracks leading to or from them, the whisper of a familiar voice outside the window when no one was there. These details, they argued, hinted at something else, something beyond ordinary explanation. An entity that did not follow human rules, one that fed on fear as much as stalkers feed on control. Most dismissed this theory as hysteria, as superstition, but those who had felt the silence themselves, who had seen the shadow at the fence, did not laugh. They simply looked away. Every theory left space for doubt. Every investigation ended the same way, unresolved. For the victim, that lack of closure was the final cruelty. Without proof, there was no end. Without answers, there was no escape. The stalker thrived in the silence between contradictions, in the vacuum left by explanations that could never align. What remained was a haunting certainty that no theory could erase. Someone was there. Someone listened. Someone watched. And whether they were stranger or neighbor, whether they were one or many, whether they were human or something else entirely, did not change the truth. The figure at the edge of the yard was real. The silence outside the window was real. The waiting was real. And the most chilling question that none of the theories resolved was simple. What did the stalker want? Control, contact, violence? Or was the act of watching enough, feeding endlessly on the fear it created? Without knowing the answer, the victim could never prepare, and that was the point. The story of the stalker does not end with an arrest, a confession, or a courtroom. It ends the way it began, in silence. A silence heavier than any sound, a silence that never explains itself. For the victim, the silence remained long after the figure at the fence was gone, long after the phone calls stopped, long after the police files were closed and stored away. But silence is not absence. Silence is memory. It follows. It lingers in the way the victim flinched at footsteps behind them in crowded streets, in the way they checked every lock twice before sleep, in the way they avoided answering unknown numbers forever after. Even years later, in a different home in a different town, the silence returned at night, pressing against the walls, whispering the same question. Are they still out there? For neighbors, the story also endured. They remembered the figure at the edge of the yard, the car parked too long on the corner, the sound of gravel crunching when no one was seen. They never spoke of it openly, but the fear spread quietly, reshaping their own routines. Curtains were drawn earlier. Windows were locked more carefully. People learned to ignore certain sights rather than acknowledge them. To name it was to invite it. The investigators never came back. Their reports ended in words like inconclusive, insufficient, unverified. But the officers who had walked the property carried it with them. Some left the job months later, claiming stress. Others admitted in private that they still saw shapes in their peripheral vision, still woke in the night to the sensation of being observed. For them, the case was not closed. It was unfinished, unresolved, and worse, it was contagious. And then there are the unanswered details, the contradictions that remain sharp. How did the stalker call the phone while being seen outside? How did footprints appear without tracks leading to or away? Why did the whispers at the window sometimes carry a voice that sounded familiar? These fragments remain like shards of glass, never fitting together, never forming a whole. They suggest a truth more terrifying than one explanation. They suggest that the stalker was not simply a person but an experience. A presence, something that stepped into the victim's life and hollowed it out, not to be caught, not to be explained, but to be endured. The closing of the story is not closure, it is realization. Realization that a stalker's greatest power is not in the act of following, but in the mark they leave behind. The fear does not stop when they stop watching. The fear becomes part of the victim, embedded in their thoughts, their instincts, their every movement. The stalker leaves, but the fear remains. And in that way, the stalker never truly leaves at all. For the listener, the reflection carries its own weight. These stories do not belong only to one person. They are not confined to one house, one street, one neighborhood. They happen everywhere in silence, unnoticed until it is too late. They can happen in the most ordinary places, to the most ordinary lives, without warning, without reason, without end. And the most haunting truth is this: you may never know if it is happening to you. How many times have you walked home and felt footsteps behind you, only to tell yourself it was nothing? How many times have you seen a car parked in the same place but dismissed it as coincidence? How many times have you looked out a window at night and thought you saw a figure, only to blink and tell yourself it was shadow? What if it was not? What if the silence outside your door is not silence at all, but patience? What if the figure you think you imagined is still standing there, watching, waiting, measuring your every hesitation? The story ends here, but not with answers. It ends with the same image that began it. A house lit faintly by a porch light, a door locked against the night, and a figure at the edge of the yard, unmoving, unseen by most, unforgettable to one. And as you sit here, listening, remember, stalkers are not ghosts. They are not monsters invented for stories. They are real. They live in the silence, in the stillness, in the shadows that linger just beyond the reach of light. So the question remains, pressing in as the silence deepens. If someone was watching you right now, how would you know?